very much for having me here to speak today. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
But I should speak in front of the microphone because we're taping. Yes, is that right? Okay. It is very nice to be back here. Catherine and I had a wonderful time here last year around this time, and it's nice to be back. Thank you very much for having us, and special thanks to Professor Wanmande for making the arrangements, and to his colleagues for having us here. I'm going to be talking about something different from my topic. Last year, I spoke about the relationship between political economy and culture, and I emphasized more the cultural side of communication studies. Today, I'm going to spend more time on the political economy side of communication studies, and specifically talk to you about a project that Professor McKercher and I have been working on for the past now close to 3 years to study labor and workers in the communication industries, but more broadly what we call the knowledge industries, which encompass media, but also computer work, and work in those professions that are responsible for the production and the distribution of information and communication. I want to bring to your attention the first major results of our research, published in the Canadian Journal of Communication in a special issue of this journal, a double issue, which features articles about labor, including an article by Professor Cheng DeLuy. Chad, who's here, good to see you again.
Yeah.
His excellent research on labor in the Taiwanese journalism industry is included, and we're very grateful that you have contributed. The next publication will be a book that Catherine and I are working on, Professor McKercher and I, which will include a chapter on working in the animation industry from Professor Day. So we're very grateful for your contribution to our work. Now, I want to dedicate my presentation to two knowledge workers who represent the significant political and ethical questions that knowledge workers face today. These two people have been involved in significantly dramatic events, but ones that many knowledge workers face in the world today. They happen both to be people who come from my town, our town, Ottawa, Canada. One is named Mayor Arar. He is a Canadian who also holds a Syrian citizenship. So he's both Canadian and Syrian. 5 years ago, Mr. Arar was an ordinary knowledge worker. He is a computer scientist who specializes in telecommunications, an engineer, but very much a typical knowledge worker, skilled professional. 3 years ago, he was a prisoner undergoing torture in a prison in Syria. Now, how do you go from being an ordinary knowledge worker, computer scientist, to a Syrian prison? Well, after the events of 9/11, people like Mr. Arar were watched very closely. And among other things, he simply happened to be having a conversation outside of a hotel in Ottawa with a person who was on a watch list kept by our Canadian security forces. He decided to take a trip back home to see his family in Syria, which he did. And on the way back, he had to change planes in New York City to come back home to Ottawa. As it happens, the Canadian security officials told American security officials that he had been talking to some worrisome people. As a result, the American authorities picked him up at Kennedy Airport, questioned him for a short time, and sent him back to Syria. Why? Because the U.S. had a policy, it still does, called extraordinary rendition. That's the language that's used. It sounds technical, but what it means is a policy of sending back to countries that torture people, people that America is not permitted to torture in the United States. Mr. Arar spent 2 years in a prison undergoing torture before, as a result of great pressure by many other knowledge workers, including people in the media, he was freed from his prison and sent back to Canada, where he has been completely absolved. No crimes. Do you know what he was talking about outside the hotel in Ottawa? He was talking to someone about what is the best inkjet printer. But it happened to be someone who the security officials in Canada were worried about. What is the best inkjet printer? Gets him sent to Syria for torture. He came back to Canada, and after great pressure, this did not happen easily. You know, it is interesting. People say, this cannot happen in a country like Canada. Well, it did. And the only reason he was absolved was because of great pressure. A judicial commission was set up, and a judge said there was absolutely no evidence to charge him with any crime. So I dedicate this talk first to Mr. Arar, a knowledge worker who had to face significant political, ethical, moral issues. The second person I would dedicate it to is a journalist in Ottawa who happens to be a good friend of Professor McKercher and a friend to me. Her name is Juliette O'Neill. Julie O'Neill writes for our newspaper in Ottawa, the Ottawa Citizen, the main newspaper in Canada's capital. She didn't know Mr. Arar until the events began to be made known to people in Canada and elsewhere. But over time, she was given information by a member of the security forces of Canada. And that person told her that, yes, he is guilty of crimes, Mr. Arar. You can write stories, but you cannot name me. I will be your source. And so she wrote stories after thinking about it. Again, another knowledge worker doing her job. And she wrote stories that implicated, based on her source, Mr. Arar in some of what people might claim to be terrorist activity. Soon after she wrote these stories, security forces arrived at her home in Ottawa, forced her to leave her home, and removed lots of her materials, including her computers. They took her hard drives. They took her documents. And they said, unless you reveal the source, we will charge you under anti-terrorist legislation that Canada had just passed, and you can do 10 years in jail, 10 years in Canada, if you don't reveal your source. Now again, she's a knowledge worker. Like many of you might want to become a journalist. And Ms. O'Neill, as a professional journalist, said, no, I will not reveal my source. And so the case dragged on. They threatened to charge her, but did not. They kept all of her documents until she, with the support of her newspaper and her union, and we'll talk about labor unions, sued the security forces and said, we will go to court and I will force you to give back my documents and to stop you from threatening to charge me with a crime. And so the case went on. Now imagine you're a journalist and you think any time now you can be charged with a crime that will put you in jail for 10 years simply because you will not reveal the name of a source. This is not supposed to happen in Canada or the US. But in this climate for knowledge workers, it does. Thankfully, we still have a very good judicial system. So the judge that said that Mr. Arar was not guilty, another judge said our security forces violated the rights of Ms. O'Neill, required that they give back all of her documents, including her hard drives and her computers, and they struck down as unconstitutional those statutes that said they can charge a Canadian journalist with a crime punishable by up to 10 years in jail for refusing to reveal a source. But it took several years of great stress and great pressure before an ordinary computer scientist, Mayor Arar, and an ordinary journalist could receive justice. Now, most likely, people like yourselves who are knowledge workers or plan to become knowledge workers won't have to face these same challenges. But who knows? Most Canadians would never believe that my country would do this to a computer scientist or a journalist. So I dedicate this talk to my colleagues, my friend, Mayor Arar and Juliette O'Neill, who embody the political and ethical issues that knowledge workers face today. Now, I want to talk some about knowledge and information workers. Again, media workers, information workers. Partly because communication studies, media studies, the fields that we are associated with, have not treated in research or in textbooks, in the material we produce for education, have not taken labor seriously enough. In other words, media studies has done a very good job of studying media content. So what is the impact of television programs on the audience? They have done a good job, pretty good job of studying audiences. But media studies has not done enough to study labor, the work of people who produce and distribute media and information. And this is unfortunate, partly because of the examples I suggested of Mr. Arar and Ms. O'Neill, but also because there are significant issues worldwide, globalization, the enormous transformation in the international division of labor, issues like outsourcing that we all face in different ways all over the world. We don't know what the nature of knowledge work will be like in the future with the impact of new technology. We don't know if there will be jobs or whether the new technologies will take those jobs. We don't know what those jobs will be like. Will they be regimented, as Chad has pointed out in his own research on journalists, or will the new technologies liberate knowledge workers? We don't know enough about this, and as a result, Professor McKercher and I have launched our research program with the help of a grant from the Canadian government. Canadian government does some good things. It doesn't just arrest computer scientists and journalists. They have given us a grant to spend several years to do research on knowledge workers. And our goal is to bring to the center of media studies the changing world of knowledge and information workers. Now, I cannot tell the whole story here today. I can only tell a few bits and pieces of it. And I'm going to concentrate on what knowledge workers themselves are doing to help benefit them and help make their work better and their working conditions better. Now, even though communication studies has by and large ignored knowledge workers, there is a history of research that at least has given us a foundation to do the kind of work we are doing. At the end of the Second World War, scholars began to notice that there was a new kind of worker on the scene. Workers who didn't work so much in factories, but rather in offices. So people like Fritz Machlup began to count these workers and noticed that they were growing in large numbers. Professor Mark Porat in the 1960s looked at the changing occupations of knowledge workers and argued that whereas in the past agricultural, that is farm workers, were dominant, and in the more recent memory industrial workers replaced them, increasingly information workers were taking center stage in our understanding of occupations and the occupational structure. The most important theorist was a sociologist who I had the good fortune to work with as a student. He was Professor Daniel Bell, whose book, The Coming of a Post-Industrial Society, is arguably one of the most important books of the 20th century because Professor Bell described what he felt would be the political significance of a world full of knowledge workers. Now, he tended to be quite optimistic. Bell believed that there would be a shift in power from those who controlled finances or money to those who controlled knowledge or information. Now, he didn't go to the extreme of believing that journalists would run the world, but he came kind of close to suggesting it at times, that with our education, with our knowledge, we will become the new power elite in the world. Now, almost as soon as Bell produced his book, he was criticized by some very important scholars, one of whom may be familiar certainly to some of you. Bell's book came out in 1973. Interestingly, in that same year, two other books came out that have had an enormous influence on our field. One by Professor Herbert Schiller. You've heard of Professor Herbert Schiller? Some of you are nodding. Professor Schiller's book, The Mind Managers, came out in the same year as Bell's The Coming of a Post-Industrial Society. Only Schiller's book was more, he worried that instead of giving power to knowledge workers, the growth of technology would lead to the concentration of power in large businesses that control the production and the distribution of communication and media. Professor Schiller, as you would know, had a long career of arguing with the more optimistic people, suggesting that there were dangers in the knowledge industries as companies like Time Warner, IBM, Microsoft, Sony, Bertelsmann, the big companies would control power. So he sent to his students the suggestion that we look more critically at knowledge, the knowledge industries. In that same year, 1973, another book appeared that Chad, I know you know well. It is Harry Braverman's book, Labor and Monopoly Capital. Professor Braverman, again, writing the same year as Bell and Schiller, focused on what is going on in the workplace of knowledge and service labor. And he argued that the workplace for a journalist or a clerk working in a bureaucracy, in a government office, is really no different from a factory. That the same principles that controlled industrial labor controlled knowledge labor. So rather than a world that Bell described that suggested knowledge workers would gain power and control over their work, for Braverman, the knowledge workplace would be one in which those who held power, the kind of power that Schiller described, would also control knowledge workers. And the suggestion was that for knowledge workers to be free and to control their own work and their technology, they would have to organize themselves in the same way that industrial workers organize themselves in factories. Now, there has been interesting research since these books came out in 1973, and lots of debate back and forth between those who are optimistic and those who are not. Catherine will describe some of this research in her presentation, so I won't go into much detail. But people like Professor Ursula Hughes, whose book, The Making of a Cybertariat, very interesting title, take off on Marx's discussion of the proletariat, the cybertariat, the new working class, Ursula Hughes in England. Nicholas Dyer Witherford has looked at labor in the video game industry, which of course is prominent here in Taiwan as well as in many other locations in the world today. Manuel Castells has talked about informational labor. These people have framed the current debates around this field. But I would like to turn with a bit more focus to the research that we are working on and use a term to help me describe this research that will be familiar to some of you. The term has been used a lot in discussion of information technology. It is called convergence. You've heard convergence? You've heard the term? Some of you have. There are many different ways to think about convergence. Typically, it is described as bringing together the technologies of communication. So the computer, the telephone, the television come together, they converge into new systems for production, distribution, and display of media and information. And many scholars have said technological convergence is changing our world. And we all understand it. I have some of these technologies. In fact, when I travel, I usually have now more technology than I have clothes. My bag typically has more computer, iPod, etc., than I have clothes to wear. So we're all familiar with convergence. So my iPod has music, video, the pictures of my children. They converge into one technology. So you can begin to understand it makes some sense to talk about technological convergence. Others have talked about institutional convergence. That is, not just technologies are coming together, but the organizations, the companies that produce them are coming together. Sony, Microsoft, Time Warner, News Corp. They now include journalism, broadcasting, telecommunication, high tech, all under one roof. Convergence. Now, we have developed new ways of thinking about convergence. In my last book, which I discussed some last time I was here, called The Digital Sublime, I talk about convergence as a myth. That is, as a story that we like to tell to make us feel better about ourselves. Everyone likes to feel that the world we live in is better than any world that has come before. So we tell stories. Isn't it great that my iPod has music and video and everything else? What a wonderful world we live in because our technologies can do everything. Now, in many ways, this is a myth. I don't mean that it's false. Rather, in the more classical sense of a myth, it is a great story that exaggerates the truth to make us all feel good about ourselves and our world. Now, that can be a good thing, but it can also be a problem if our myths lead us to forget the problems that come with technological and institutional convergence. The problems of the divisions between the rich and the poor in technology. The problems that communication workers face, like our friend Ms. O'Neill, who has all the technology in the world, but that would have done her no good if she were in jail for doing her job. So myth sometimes gets in the way of thinking critically. So we have to be critical of myth. Now, there is another way that we think about convergence, and one of the main themes of our research project is to examine labor convergence. In this world of communication and media, it is not just the technologies, not just the corporations, and not just the myths that are converging, but it's also the work and the workers. You may experience this in some of your classes if you're a student in a reporting class. You now learn that you have to be a master of all of these technologies because your job isn't just to tell a story, it's to tell it in every different form that the technology makes possible. So it used to be when a journalist came into my office to do an interview with me, there might be, someone with a video camera, someone with a notebook, someone to manage what these two were doing. I might have 3 or 4 people in the office. Now, one person comes in with a camera on her shoulder and the tape recorder and the notebook and all sorts of plugs and wires that I usually help to set up and that don't always work right. This is convergence in labor. The worker having to do more and more things. Now, in a way, this is a good thing because workers who are in media, communication, or information technology can master new technologies, have more skill, more talent. But it also means they have more work. And sometimes the technical work gets in the way of the most important thing, which is telling the story. If you have to worry about the camera, or the tape recorder, or the microphone, or the plugs, or the camera angles, or the makeup, you might not be able to tell a good story. So while there are good elements to the convergence in work, there are also significant problems. Now, we are focusing on another aspect of labor convergence. Because communication and media workers are beginning to come together, converge, to defend their rights and their interests. That is, they are organizing into convergent labor unions and worker associations to protect their rights, their knowledge, their skills. And not many people who study media are looking at this. And that is one of the reasons why we have launched this project, because there are many interesting developments, some of which, and I can't of course go into all of them, but some of which I'll share with you, especially interesting ones taking place in North America, where we are based, but also in Europe and some in Asia. Now, it is in some ways difficult to talk about labor unions to people who work in the field of media and communication. After all, typically what people, they scratch their head and they say, labor unions? They're old-fashioned. Labor unions were needed when we had factories, maybe. But not today. We are professionals. Professionals don't need labor unions. Why is this professor who talks about new technology concentrating on some old idea? Well, I hope to convince you that it is indeed important to think about labor unions. Our friend Ms. O'Neill is very happy to be a part of a labor union. She may owe her freedom in part to that, as do many others. And one of the most interesting things that we have discovered, and Professor McKercher wrote about this in a book based on her research in the areas of journalism and broadcasting, News Workers Unite. I always give advertisements to my partners' research. News Workers Unite talks about how unions are bringing together workers from different parts of the knowledge sector. Let me explain. In the United States, the Communication Workers of America, CWA, Communication Workers of America, represents 700,000 workers. It's a large number of workers. And over the years, they have built a union that includes journalists, radio TV people, telephone workers, telecommunications workers, and high-tech workers, all under the same union. Both on-air people, reporters, and technical workers, people who run the cameras, know how the machines operate. Telephone operators and the people who build the networks. They're all part of one union. This is what we mean by labor convergence. If News Corp, the big company, can bring together newspapers, broadcasters, telecom companies, and high-tech companies, so can a labor union. So where this has happened in the US, the same has happened in Canada, where our large communication union has brought together the same group of workers, including, in fact, the workers who cut down the trees for the paper. Forest industry workers in Canada are part of the same communication workers. So you have convergence from chopping the trees to making the paper, to printing the paper, to reporting the stories that go on the paper, to distributing the paper. Very important. Why is this important? Well, in the journal, we have an article called Convergence Bites Back. Convergence Bites Back. What does that mean? Well, many people have written about convergence to talk about, as I've described, the power of the technology or the power of the businesses. But we have examples of how convergence bites back at the companies when labor unions converge to defend their rights. I'll give you a concrete example, which we describe in our article in this issue. 2 years ago, because of budget cutbacks and the application of corporate principles to our public broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the people who run CBC, our radio, TV, national broadcaster, said, workers at the CBC, we want to accept more part-time, temporary workers at lower wages. We want to outsource some of the work, and we want you to accept this in your contract. Now, the workers had a contract that said only a certain percentage could be shifted to part-time or contracted out. The company wanted to increase that. Fewer full-time workers, more part-time, temporary, casual workers who could be easily fired. You understand? The workers said no. They are part of the large converged union in Canada. That includes telephone workers as well as broadcast workers and newspaper workers. And they said, no, we will not accept this. I have to make one correction. In fact, which makes it even more interesting. They were part of a Canadian union. They are, in fact, at that point, became part of the American Union, which was even larger than the Canadian Union, to represent workers at the Canadian broadcaster. So they're part of a large union. That's what matters. And the company said, you must accept this. And they said no. So the company locked them out. Said, if you don't accept our contract, don't come to work. And shut down their operation. And they put on reruns and BBC News and all sorts of programs that Canadians were very upset to hear on radio or TV. But they thought, the workers are weak, The person who is the news anchor, he'll come back to work. The news anchor will never get along with the camera worker, the technical and the on-air people. They won't get along. They'll come back to work quickly. 1 week pass, 2 weeks pass, 3 weeks pass. Meanwhile, the workers, part of a large union that has more money because it's so big, more power to lobby, that is to put pressure on government. They come together, they organize a caravan across Canada broadcasting on community stations. They weren't allowed on the national broadcaster. So our daughter works at the University of Toronto radio station. It's a small community station in Toronto. They welcomed in the CBC workers and said, you tell your story on our station. So they mobilized support across Canada. Now, they would not have been able to do this if they were not part of a large union with money and influence. And interestingly enough, the different kinds of workers, the person who reads the news in front of the camera and the person operating the camera, both knowledge workers, they got along very well. And they agreed that they would have to join hands to defend their interests. Well, after 2 months, the company gave in. 2 months. Canadians wanted their hockey back on television. So, the company lost. They had to accept most of the workers and the union's demands. Convergence bit back. Instead of having their jobs broken down, turned into part-time, de-skilled, cuts in pay, which has happened in case after case after case, the CBC workers, because they benefited and had put their trust in trade union convergence, they won. Now, this doesn't happen in every case, and in our research we have documented also the failures. One good example in Hollywood, where the workers should get together because they are facing the largest companies in the world, the companies that produce and run the film and video industry in the world. The workers, the actors, the camera people, the technicians, are members of unions. Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. But they have not been able to come together in one converged union. And part of our research is to find out why. Why in Hollywood, where they face the big companies, do the workers not come together to increase their strength? Some of it is the culture, a culture of independence. Some of it is the difference between the more radical elements and the more conservative elements in the unions. So sometimes convergence works as it did at the CBC. Sometimes it doesn't. But one of the other things that convergence has made possible, and I'm going to tell you something that you probably would have a hard time even believing. There are actually labor organizations in the computer industry. Out of all places, Microsoft. But don't tell Bill Gates. I don't think he knows it. Well, he probably does. Because of labor convergence, the Communication Workers of America, the union with 700,000 workers, including the Canadian broadcasting workers, have been able to use some of their money and their power to support computer workers, people who write code, people like Mr. Arar, to whom I dedicated this talk, who work on the engineering side. Why do these people need a union? Well, partly because the same things are happening to them that the CBC tried to impose on their workforce. Cutbacks in full-time workers, only part-time workers, no health benefits, no pensions. Working at Microsoft for a large number of workers is like a factory, only it's a factory that produces code, not toys or items that we typically associate with a factory. Lots of the work at Microsoft is like a code writing factory. So the Converged Union, the Communication Workers of America, helped to create an organization at Microsoft called the Washington Alliance of Technical Workers, what we call WashTech, for the state of Washington, where Microsoft is located. And it is now an organization with a very large presence, especially in cyberspace. You can find WashTech on the net. That has organized workers at Microsoft in what we call a worker association. You call it a worker association because Microsoft has too much power to allow a formal union. They don't negotiate contracts, but they provide benefits to their workers, including health benefits. They also have taken Microsoft to court. They've sued Microsoft and won benefits and back pay for workers who Microsoft has mistreated over the years. They are also very important in lobbying to protect the jobs of American workers, which increasingly are being sent to other parts of the world, including this part of the world, where the work in the computer industry is cheaper. So it is a complicated process, but what's interesting from the point of view of knowledge workers is WashTech may represent the future for technical knowledge workers. Organize a professional worker association to defend your membership. Now, increasingly, and this is the next step in our research project, labor convergence is taking on an international character. It's not just American or Canadian, though there are important models there to look at. But increasingly, international labor federations. One of the most important is based in Switzerland. It's called the Union Network International, or UNI, U-N-I, has brought together millions of union members in the world who work in media, telecommunication, high tech, to defend their interests. We're talking here on the order of 10 million or more workers. Now, again, here mainly in Europe and North America. But what's especially interesting about this organization is that it is coming to Asia, especially to India, which is the source of a lot of high technology labor. Microsoft, for example, has an enormous presence, as you may know, in Bangalore and in other centers in India. UNI, this Swiss-based international federation, is coming to India, where it is establishing connections to worker organizations in India to try to establish international labor convergence, so that jobs that are sent to India because the labor is cheaper will be improved with higher wages better working conditions for Indian workers. So UNI and other international labor federations are developing a presence in the less developed parts of the world, which are increasingly absorbing knowledge labor, to establish a kind of global solidarity. So the next stage in our research project is to go to India, go to other parts of Asia, to see whether or not this is a successful effort at labor convergence. What can be learned from developing a kind of international knowledge worker solidarity? Let me conclude. I'm going to leave you with a question. First with a question that is not so important, but which gets a lot of attention, and then with a question that is very important, that I hope you keep in mind as you do your research and as you launch your careers in this area. Because we tend to be very infatuated, worshipful of the technology, we think the technology is so wonderful. We are always asking the question, what will be the next new thing? Computer, iPad, cell phone that cooks you breakfast, whatever. What will be the next new thing? There are even books with that title, The Next New Thing. I'm telling you that that is not the most important question. Because if the workers who make the technology, who write the code, who tell the stories, who run the cameras, have to accept low wages, bad working conditions, who lose their jobs, well, a lot of the world is not going to be able to buy the next new thing. And the next new thing is only going to lead to a decline in the standard of living for many of the people who make that new thing. The more important question, and this is the one I will leave you with today, that we might discuss somewhat. The more important question, not what will be the next new thing, but will knowledge workers of the world unite? Will knowledge workers of the world unite? Now, we don't know the answer to that question, but it seems to me, in this world of transforming technology and of big corporations producing the technology and the media, whether or not our world in the future is a democratic one, is a world in which we are all relatively equal, this will depend on the answer to the question, will knowledge workers of the world unite? So thank you. So we have time if anyone would like to raise a question, make a comment. I'm happy to hear. So don't be shy.
Okay. First, I want to thank you for the advertising my paper in your speech.
Oh,
and
remember.
Okay, and I got a question about workers and technology, but about the unification or solidarity of workers in Taiwan. Because just 2 weeks ago, a big Taiwanese newspaper group just shut down one of its newspapers, Vincent Mosco, and then many journalists were laid off illegally to a certain extent. And then some students and some union movements, some other unions want to organize a demonstration to show their support to those laid off tourists. But ironically, these journalists in Vincent Daily try to stop the protest because they worry about that would damage their rights when they negotiate with the management. I think it's very interesting because you and Dr. McCurcher just showed in your paper in this journal,
right.
say that one of the factors that CBC's strike be successful is that they have the support from the public.
Yes.
But in Taiwan, it's not the same thing. It's
yes.
like they don't want the public support because they worry about that would damage their like compensation or something like that. So my question is that what's your opinion about the relationship between the public and the union, and what's your suggestion for a scholar like you to show your support to those unions?
I think that's a wonderful question, and it doesn't surprise me because, well, I know you appreciate my giving publicity to your article. It is one of the best articles I've come across on the study of the journalism workplace. And I know that were he alive today, Harry Braverman would be very proud of you as well for making such good use of his work. But I must stop now and answer the question.
Yes,
you raise a very important question because, see, the public has always been important for unions, even in the industrial era. So if you were in a community that had a large factory and the factory workers went on strike, the strike might succeed or might not, depending on whether the public, let's say, would continue to buy products made by the company or would provide food and money to the workers while they were on strike, help the families. So there has always been a history of the need for public support. But now it's even more important than ever because the companies that own media and other knowledge companies absolutely depend on the mass continued patronage of consumers who need to watch TV or buy the newspaper or listen to the radio. And if they were able to continue to support the company, then it would be very hard for the workers. So part of our job, now I say our, I mean part of the job of the unionists, is to maintain ongoing ties to their audiences, the people who read their work, have to continue to support them. And it doesn't always happen, because you know, you may have some broadcasters here, we do in Canada, who don't appreciate their audiences as much as they should. Maybe look down on them or think they are better than their audiences. It's very important to maintain ongoing solidarity. Now, it is especially important for us in the academic world. And your question helps me to make what I think is an important point about the knowledge workers in universities. I have just written an article for a magazine in Canada about academic knowledge worker unions. And my point there is that we have unions. I'm a member of a union, as is Professor McCurcher, but those unions tend to be separate from the media unions and the high-tech unions. We keep separate. And our unions don't join hands with media worker unions. Partly because many academics believe they are better than media workers. So we have become the new aristocracy of labor. We are the elite of labor, and that's a problem. We in the universities need to realize, one, we are workers. No different from other workers. We don't produce for Toys R Us, but we produce for publishers, for universities, for people who pay our wage. We're wage laborers. We have to realize we are workers. And as workers, we need to defend the rights not only of ourselves as teachers, but of all knowledge workers. So we have to join hands and support other knowledge workers. And so there is a role for us too. So as a professor, I have to develop solidarity with my students. Because in many respects, the students are like those who purchase a newspaper, those who watch a TV show. They are the audience, the customers, the people we need to maintain good relationships with. And we're not, although there may be the tradition that we are superior, we are not. So that when academic workers, as they do from time to time, go on strike, they need the support of their students. And the students shouldn't give their support unless they believe that their professors are right and are good enough to earn that support. So as a professor, I think it's very important for you and for us to maintain good relationships with fellow knowledge workers and with our future knowledge workers, our students. Go ahead.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question. Because the difficulty of union solidarity for this case shows is that the union member in Vincent Daily would refuse the public support because they don't want to damage their relationship with the management when they negotiate. So it's kind of dilemma for the public because the union don't want our help.
I know, and so that's a union that needs to be changed. I mean, that is that. It's as simple as that. I don't need to go on. That is a union that doesn't understand convergence, doesn't understand that in the knowledge world, we are all connected, and we need the support. So a union that doesn't want the support of its customers is a union that doesn't want to be around for long, and maybe doesn't deserve to be around for long. So you should go there and give them advice, as we do. Catherine and I work with unions. Part of changing the world is not just doing research, it's being there. And we advise unions on their strategies, help them. And I think they need to be told by people like yourself who know well that they need the support of their customers. Hopefully they'll listen to you. And if they don't, maybe someone in the union will. You had a question.
Okay, thank you. Please allow me to follow Dr. Lowe's question because I have worked for the paper he mentioned for 4 years, and I was gone 10 years ago. So I was happy I was not laid off by this newspaper. Yeah. And my question is, as we mentioned earlier, we think that we should speak for ourselves or for others. But the key point is I found that sometimes reporters seldom speak for reporters. Do you know what I'm saying? Because the United Daily newspapers, they have different branches such as Mission Daily, United Daily, Economy Daily, and the United Evening. But to my knowledge, no one speaks for them. After the owner of the newspaper laid off many employees. And my question is, that is very difficult because most of the people who are the leaders of the, unions, they are very loyal to the owners of the papers.
Yes.
So it's kind of problematic when they want to fight for the rights of workers. So my question is, how could the owner and the unions go hand in hand, that could be kind of problematic because sometimes they are look at the same issue from the different perspectives. The second question is, I'm very interested in your question that you proposed at the end of your speech. You said that will knowledge workers of the world unite? But my question is, will owners of newspapers unite? So maybe we can look at this from the different perspective and from the other side.
Yes.
And the third question is, I totally agree with your suggestion. We need to educate our students about their rights, especially their working rights, because that is very important. Because I have never received that kind of education when I was an undergraduate student in Taipei. And to my knowledge, sometimes we pay more attention to writing, how to compose a good piece of newspaper, a good piece of news, but we still mention that you need to work on this because it seems to me that it is not the kind of a key point that we would like to focus on. So I would like to hear your thoughts on the questions that I have. Thank you so much.
Okay, there is a lot there, and I'll try to be brief. I'll direct the last one first, and I don't want to make the life of the director of your program more difficult. He's a wonderful man, and he's been very kind to Catherine and me. But I do suggest that if you don't already have a course about labor and working and the political kinds of issues that are tied to what it means to be a media worker, not just the technical worker, technical issues, but the political issues, perhaps you should. And there are universities that are now developing these courses, labor and the media, that would study the different aspects of what it means to be a media worker, what unions are, what their relationships have been historically with corporations. That can be very useful information, not just the stuff of the academic world and things that you would put in an exam, but could be a very, very practical benefit. You asked about owners of the world uniting. They are already doing that. I mean, that's clearly the case. I talked about convergence among corporations. You take a company like News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's operation. It is a global conglomerate now, and 6 or 7 of them control now most of the world's production, distribution of information, communication, and media. So owners have already figured that out. They have united. What we are hoping and seeing to a degree, although slowly, is that workers are catching on and at the national and increasingly international level are beginning to unite. Now you are right. From time to time, the interests of owners and workers correspond. But often they don't. Owners don't answer to workers. They don't even answer to their customers. They answer to their stockholders. And increasingly, a global conglomerate like News Corp cares more about whether its stockholders earn a profit than whether its newspaper is of good quality or even whether it has many readers. Concrete example, newspapers around the world would rather accept lower circulation, eliminate readers, provided the readers it has are wealthy. Why? Because they are the ones who spend more money on the advertising. So we have newspapers in Canada that have eliminated readers. We don't want working class readers because they don't have money. Don't read our newspaper. We only want well-to-do readers. So the interests are not often aligned. So yes, it is okay to be loyal to your employer, but don't be blinded by it. Don't accept the mythology that the combination of technology and business is going to make everyone better. That's not the case for the millions of workers whose jobs are lost every day in the knowledge and communication business. So the result is that you have to do what has been done historically. You have to defend your own interests in your own organizations. And that can be difficult, it can be painful, there's no doubt about that. I would rather be loyal to my university, but sometimes my university is not loyal to me. So I'm happy to be part of a union. My university now wants to eliminate a large portion of my pension. Why? Because it is expensive, and they don't want to give pensions to people like me who are going to live a long time, hopefully, and collect my pension. Now, I have been loyal to my university, and I say, why do you want to cut out my pension? I have been loyal. Sorry, we need the money to hire professors. Is that what my loyalty buys me? So, if you don't accept my loyalty, my union will help me. And I think one has to increasingly recognize that, however painful, however difficult. Now, I answered, I think, 2 of your questions, but the first one escapes me.
My first question is that sometimes reporters think that they needed to speak for others, but they seldom speak for themselves.
Right. And I mean, that is an interesting point, and I love that expression. I'm going to remember it. That, you know, reporters are trained to speak for the larger society, but they're not trained. And this is, you know, one reason, in a very small way, you need a labor course. Because a labor course teaches you how to speak for yourself, to develop your own interest. It does not come naturally. I can tell you from my own experience. I have a very elite education. I went to Harvard University where I got my PhD, studied with all of these important people, but they never taught me to speak for myself. Who taught me to speak for myself? My father, who operated a printing press and was a member of the Printers Union. When I was growing up, my father taught me about the importance of unions. Daniel Bell didn't. He taught me lots of other things, but he didn't teach me to speak for myself. Now, so I had the privilege of growing up in a union home, where my father taught me. In fact, he didn't even permit me to root for the New York Yankees baseball team. You know, the team that has that wonderful Taiwanese pitcher, Wang, Jimin Wang. Congratulations, he's a terrific pitcher. Though I am not a Yankee fan, and the reason I am not a Yankee fan is because my father taught me the Yankees wear uniforms with pinstripes, and only bankers wear pinstripes. They are the team of the rich. You only root for Brooklyn Dodgers, Boston Red Sox. They are working class teams. Now, it's funny, but it is also serious, because at a very early age, I learned about social class. Daniel Bell didn't teach me about social class. Vincent Mosco, my father, a unionist, taught me about that. Now, if you don't have that privilege, even if you get to go to Harvard, you need an education in learning how to speak for yourself and learning the importance of organizations that will defend your rights. That doesn't mean you have to be making a revolution all the time or taking to the streets all the time. Unions don't always do that. But simply, as you put it so well, teach you how to speak for yourself even as you are learning how to speak for others. It's brilliant. Thank you. Did you?
Professor Mosco, since you mentioned the academic union of professors, I'd like to supply you some local information. Myself, I'm one of the troublemakers who try to organize a union within the campus. There are some limitations. First, we only have a labor association, not union. That means that negotiate on equal terms with the authority of this university. And second, we are not allowed to go on strike in any case. I think that's not a big difference. Yeah, I think if we can go on strike, maybe students will give us more support.
One can only hope. Well, let me say this, and some of you are familiar with political economy, and I have spent a lot of time, as some of you know, thinking about it and writing about it. One of the difficulties I have had about political economy as a field is that it has tended to emphasize the power of those on top and the difficulty for us at the bottom. And that is not a part of my nature. I would prefer to think there are more of us than there are of them, and so we can do a lot. One of my reasons for doing the kind of research we're doing is to develop models, ways of seeing how we can make a difference. Not just write book after book about how they have power and we don't, etc. And there are some very good, I think, points to keep in mind. In the 1920s, if I can take you back that far in the United States, there was a conference of the American Economics Association. And the new president of the association, it was around 1927, 28, said in his address to the conference of all the economists in the US, unions are dead. We no longer need them in America. They are declining in their numbers. Technology means we no longer need unions, and they will disappear. That speech came just before the largest growth in labor unions in American history, which came in the 1930s. Once again, an economist is wrong. We don't know what the future will bring. And we might think now, how could the professor be talking about unions? They are disappearing, declining, and the numbers do suggest that they are getting smaller, on a percentage basis. But back in the 1920s, it was the same case. The American unions had lost 40% of their members in the 1920s. People believed that everything was going to get better and better. And then in 1929, the greatest depression to hit the industrialized world in its history took place, and unions grew tremendously. We don't know. Back in the early 1980s, people said at my university, that university will never have a union. I work at Queen's University, which is one of the most conservative universities probably in the world. But yet, because it faced budget cuts in the 1990s, had to lay off some workers, including professors, sure enough, in the 1990s, professors formed a union. And we have a union at the university, the elite university in Canada, that no one thought would have a union. So, while one doesn't want to be overly optimistic, that is, create our own myths, we also should not be overly negative or think that it won't happen. Yes, you're not allowed to strike, but that doesn't mean in a few years' time, if you work hard, you might win that right. If enough knowledge workers come together, extraordinary things can happen, and have happened. We have no idea what the world economy is going to be 5 or 10 years from now. Some people think it is growing fabulously, and when you look, for example, to mainland China, it's hard to think that any of this is going to slow down. That's exactly what they felt in 1929. There are people who think that there may be a significant economic decline, and what that would mean is that workers are going to have to protect themselves. because there won't be others looking after them. And especially knowledge workers who have the privilege of our education and our skill and our capacity to communicate. We can make enormous change in the world, politically, to defend and advance democracy. We can do that. Eventually, I think even mainland China will move in that direction. But it will need our help. And I think we need to do what we can to move it in that direction.
We have an expectation of the state which might give some helping hand to the workers. For example, I found out that Walmart went to mainland China to invest. But they were unwilling to have a labor union in the mainland. But the state, under some pressure from society, they pushed Walmart to have a labor union there.
The state can be helpful, and admittedly, the Walmart union in mainland China is not a very strong one. And often governments set up weak unions as a way to keep the peace between workers and companies. But that's not always the case. For example, in Canada, in the province of Quebec, the French-speaking province of Canada, the Quebec government worked with Walmart workers to establish a real union of Walmart workers. Now, Walmart is still fighting it, but they need people to shop at Walmart in Quebec, where there's Montreal and Quebec City and some big cities, and they need that business. So yes, governments can help, provided that we lobby continuously with them. So I have worked with governments, especially in Canada. I testify before government commissions that deal with labor unions. So I have spoken about labor convergence to help workers who want to organize a union. And the companies will say something like, well, telephone and computers have nothing to do with each other, so we don't want a union that brings together computer workers and telephone workers. So I go to the government and I tell them about convergence. And that has helped some unions to form. So it's something that is possible. Sometimes harder than other times, but I think it's important that we make this part of our work. That is, that research is not just the study of something, it is the involvement of the researcher in the world we live in to try to make it better. And that sometimes is difficult for professors to understand, but I think it's important for us to, as professors, to acknowledge that. Yes?
I think I would like to ask a more practical question concerning the strategy that you do. It's kind of like a follow-up to Chad's question. In the case of closing down of the nation state, I think a major threat facing the news workers is the right to keep their job. Probably a typical union's way to strive for the rights for the workers is to kind of like a stage of picket fencing outside the newspaper organizations. What other measure can the union do to organize the workers, like adopting a kind of like a legal measure against the ownership measure of the newspapers? Is there any possibility to go for this kind of strategy?
Yes, it is very important. A strike is a last resort. You know, even though, and for those of you who are going to be reporters, don't be like many reporters. You ignore workers until they go out on strike. Then it becomes a story. Workers are a story lots of other times. So, yeah, it's important to put up a picket line, and strikes are an important instrument, but they're only one. What is very important for unions to do is to be organizations that operate all the time for their members and to communicate their message to those who are in their communities. So, for example, my union at my university produces every month a newsletter and a kind of magazine that describes not only what the union is doing, but what are the main issues at the university at the time that people need to know about so that they can anticipate developments, or what workers at universities in other parts of Canada are doing. This is a day-to-day job for a union, to communicate to its membership, to communicate to its community. And so that when you have to call on your members to do something difficult, like go on strike, they will already have a certain degree of solidarity and trust in you to give you their support. But this can only be done as long as you're there for them all the time. That means developing a union culture. That is a culture that says unions belong, they take care of all kinds of needs and interests, they represent the community of workers. And it is very practical. It can be done, and unions that succeed tend to do that kind of thing. Education, community service, cultural activities, representation of workers who have problems in their communities, also having fun together, working as part of a community of professionals. This can be difficult because we live in a world, especially in the university, in which professors are taught to be individualists and not to talk to one another, in fact, to compete with one another. Well, unions are there in part to help build cooperation among workers. And those that build it tend to work better than those that don't. So the Canadian unions I know that succeed are ones that are there for their workers on a regular basis, doing all kinds of community work.
So I have one more question. Let me stick back to the problem of mission day, because I talked on phone with my friends who had been laid off by this company two days ago, and he told me that actually they got money from the owner. So they don't want to fight very, dramatically with the boss, because they think they just want to get more money. You know what I mean? Because they think they have already lost their job. But money is okay, but not that kind of sufficient. So this is the key point that they would like to deny the support from others. And I think it also much related to their perception of their future, because we got high salary from the owner. Yeah, several years ago we had very high salary. So we never thought that it will come to the end.
Yes.
Yeah, so people don't think that they need the worker association or unit,
yes,
because they think that my job is very stable. But one day it becomes something like this, so they were very surprised by this, because the owner never gave them any clues about the decision. They just emailed to everybody, say, come back today and we will have a dinner, and then you will be laid off today. So how could you imagine that I will have no job tomorrow? So I think it's a very, very complicated. We cannot only look at this issue from the perspective of having a job or not having a job, because it's much related to their expectation. They want money. They don't think they will lose their job someday. So I think maybe it also much related. It was also much related to people's perception of fatalism. Because people think that it's my fate, because the economy is not that kind of good. So it's reasonable because I get money. So I think the key point is they want more money. but they want to do it under the table. They don't want to show it in the public.
Well, I think you're right, and I think it's reasonable for people to want more money. You can be a supporter of labor and of human values and of democracy. It's not a sin to like money. I like my iPod. But I think we also need to recognize that part of our job is to educate people to understand that, first of all, their financial security depends on being part of a union. I don't know what the averages are like here, but in North America, we talk about the labor union dividend. That is, if you are a member of a union, you will likely earn between 15 and 20% more than your counterparts who are not part of a union. 15 to 20% more. So I think, you know, on average anyway, you're going to do better financially to be part of a union. Not to mention those other kinds of protections that create job stability, better working conditions, and the right to a grievance in the event that you are mistreated. And that can be very significant, given what happens, and those of you who have worked will know that some very strange things can happen in a workplace. And if you're on your own, challenging your boss because of some mistreatment, it's much more difficult to receive justice than if you're part of a union with a formal grievance procedure that can help you at least publicize your grievance. So it does make financial sense, but it makes more sense as well. I don't have direct experience. I've learned a lot through Professor McKercher, who has been a journalist. And we're going to end shortly because I want Professor McKercher to have the opportunity to talk as well as a professor. But we had the occasion in the town where my university is located, where, I mean, it's shocking to see what happens in newspapers. Our newspaper was bought out by someone else, and the next day, the new owner set up 2 hotel rooms at a hotel across the street from the newspaper. In one of them, the entire editorial staff, save for one person, was fired. And in the next room, there was an employment counselor to help you maybe find a job somewhere else, or to give you a box of tissues to stop you from crying. That was it. One day, you were the city editor for the local newspaper. The next day, you didn't even get the right to go back to your office. They cleaned it out for you. You were told your things can be picked up at a certain location. That's how newspapers work. Yeah, there's a lot of glamour associated with the mythology, but as you described, there is also a lot of pain, and pain that comes because people have not recognized that they need a union to defend their rights when owners can do absolutely anything they want to their workforce and get away with it unless they have a contract that stipulates what they can and can't do. And now perhaps I should draw a close to this because we do have another speaker, and I want to thank you very much for being such a good audience, with such wonderful questions, and I appreciate, once again, as I did last year, coming to this university to be able to have the opportunity to share ideas and experience. Thank you.
We'll have a 15-minute break, and we have prepared some refreshment outside. So